teaching of writing here at the University of Oregon. In 1992, I visited Michigan Tech, Ohio State, Purdue, and UC Davis to observe what they were doing in computers and writing and to interview participants in those programs. I returned and wrote a proposal for a computers and writing classroom and for a very specific structure of planning and support for it. I also wrote some principles for guiding us in the project. I promised I would do that. Some of these principles have held up pretty well, and some are so obsolete that they're funny. In fact, what's most interesting in what we face today is how completely different the problems are. Take just one example. This is the third principle in my own report. Access is critical. Students didn't own their own machines. We didn't have that many on campus. And I described these access problems at length. The availability of machines, of modems, of training in the use of computers, and of course access to the great out there just taking shape, and to which the machines were the portal. In those days, this was the political, ethical, economic, and educational issue regarding the use of computers in teaching. Access was the great scarcity. This is nowhere near the same kind of problem for us here now. If anything, our problem is perhaps too much access. We all know what we face, something wonderful and something terrible. The wonderful is more access to so much more. And the terrible is so much more access to so much more. No borders, no context, and it's all in motion, all changing so fast, all evanescent, even while 404s pile up like the fossilized remains of once living animals. Conventions and structures change faster than they can be learned. The content cannot be contained because of its explosive rate of increase. Here we are at the library's website, sifting through the database indexes and the online journals, the way the library wants us to. Safe, honest work. But we all know, only a few clicks away, are the worlds in which most other people live. Blogs, wikis, MySpaces, live journals, filters, boards, even the names of these things cannot stay current. Crisscrossed by gamers, surfers, administrative hijackers, and hackers, and criminals, and frauds, and professors, and every kind of business person, and on and on. Instant shock and stimulation, undreamed of pornography and violence, captured in constantly changing forms and representations. I haven't even mentioned the new commodities and the new shopping. And then what we care about, knowledge, some comprehension, some understanding. But knowledge spread out everywhere in all these constantly changing forms and unconventional structures, all that you could dream of. It has become a comedy of abundance. Think of that question that used to make sense not long ago. Where can I find information on X? Can anyone safely ask that question anymore? You will, of course, find too much information, too many answers, even to very specific questions. Try looking up your favorite disease. You can start with some technical information that seems solid, but you may soon discover that the Australians treat it differently from the Americans, and that the Europeans have decided not to treat it at all. You may find dissenting scientific literature or new research that conflicts with previous research. You may find discussions by support groups, people who suffer from the condition and who have very different theories and perspectives on it. So you ask one of our questions here, well, what's credible in all this? And do you think this is a way out? You may not know the authorities being cited, the organizations that have sponsored the research, but you can look into them. It depends on how much you want to be a critical thinker, how much you want to question authority, how far you want your research to go. A shortage of information will probably not be your problem. You can probably find information on the authorities backing the research, the funders, the sponsors, and information on the organizations and authorities backing them, and their histories, and the members of their boards of directors, and their investment records. There is, in fact, an infinite hyper-regression available to you if you have the intellectual and skeptical perseverance and the stomach for it and the time for it. You can look straight through the research and protocols and treatments to everything in the background. What is scarce is not access, certainly not information, but as some people have been saying, attention. In his new book, The Economics of Attention, Richard Lanham puts it this way. What is scarce is the human attention needed to make sense of information. Information is abundant. The ability to make sense of it is ever scarcer. In fact, the abundance of information makes attention all the scarcer, and this creates a new economy. If attention is scarce, then there is a great competition for it. There is also great inequity in who and what gets attention. Terrorism may be in part a crime of attention. And of course, we have entire industries of attention getting. It has become much more difficult to control information. It is everywhere, abundant. The struggle is to control attention, to create attention structures and attention traps. Lanham thinks of rhetoric as the building of attention structures. He is mainly concerned, at least in the first half of his book, which is as far as I've got, with the ways one gets attention and organizes it rhetorically. I want to think of this from a different side, from the side of how we give attention. There is an interaction between our giving our attention and someone or something else's getting it. This never really moves in only one direction. We worry a lot about how our libraries will organize and provide the right attention structures for our research. We are concerned about the right attention structures for our own educational work and for the new research, whether they are blogs or filters or wikis or the next cool thing. Every indie band in the world is probably worried right now about whether it should move from MySpace to a cooler space, a better attention trap. But the other side of this is ourselves as attention givers. I have a hypothesis. Since attention is what makes sense of information, and so a kind of knowledge, attention is best understood as an intellectual virtue. It is the intellectual virtue by means of which we not only know what's important, but also by which we are actually able to give our attention to what's more important. So the importance of attention is not solely on the technical side. It's not simply a matter of designing better attention structures. And intellectual virtue is not just wisdom or knowledge or intuition or prudence or skill. The intellectual virtue of attention or attentiveness is the power to give the proper attention to the proper thing. This, of course, requires discipline, restraint, self-control, something to hold us back so that the fitting thing, what we really want, can have a space of attention in which to show up. It requires, obviously, knowing what the proper thing is. This knowledge comes from an education or formation in the broadest sense, and from other virtues and abilities, like memory and common sense, and a practical knowledge that understands the circumstances of the concrete situation one is in. In fact, to continue with Aristotle, the virtue of attention depends on all the other intellectual and practical virtues, because it is a direction of the will that through education and formation becomes habits of attentiveness. We could say then, with Lanham, that perhaps rhetoric is, from one view, the building of attention structures, but an education in rhetoric, which requires the development of all those virtues just mentioned, is the building of attentiveness in human beings. What is the relationship between these two appearances of the word rhetoric? Let me give you one more thing from Aristotle, just for fun, and to connect the old and the new. It's from the Poetics. Aristotle has just finished discussing the effects of tragedy, its cathartic impact, and its ability to clarify the human condition. How do poets know how to do this in the right way, he asks. And he discusses several ways in which their work can go wrong. He concludes, when it is right, it is chance rather than techne. That is, it is not methodical. Quote, tragedies are about a few families. For in the experiments of the poets, it was from no technical knowledge, but purely by chance, that they found out how to produce these effects in their stories. They were obliged to have recourse to those few families in which such calamities befell. I would say that they knew how to give attention to what was worth attention, and it was careful attention, and to just a few things. Aristotle calls this chance, or touche, and opposes it to techne. But chance has special meanings in Aristotle, as I am learning from Melissa Shu, and it has a place in the physics with interesting relations to the four causes. Chance is sometimes what makes a difference, if one gives attention. It is all in how one undergoes the encounter, all in one's attentiveness, all in restraining the techne and letting the touche take its rightful place. So for me, the challenge is, of course, how to develop my own attentiveness in the face of all the attention trapping flashing around me. But for us, what role does the cultivation of this intellectual virtue play in our work as educators? For us, as leaders of student souls into the shining, flashing, pleasure-giving city of the new research. Is there a leader to fill in here?
So I take it you'll take questions and comments.
I thought I was the one asking the questions.
Take comments.
I'll take comments. Answers? Anybody? Answers? I'm really shocked that you don't have a whole curriculum and pedagogy available to teach intellectual virtues.
Well, now some discipline is going to have to be forthcoming because you are all participants and not just an audience here. And so I think it would be a good idea to try to put Jim Crosswhite a little more on the hot seat here and ask him a couple of questions or make a couple of comments about his thesis, which is pretty interesting and exciting, I think. And Jim, I think you should come back. Since we're serving as a kind of model for how this is going, it's going a little more informally than it's starting, so we need to be a little more informal, and we need to be a lot more collaborative. So questions will be here.
One theme that we are developing here is the theme that tries to bring into relationship the traditional or old rhetorical principles and how they relate to the new technology, what Suzanne Clark is calling the new research approach. And given what you have written and you've served as, I think you served as the director of the composition program here, how would you suggest that we approach an integration? Is that if you think the two ought to be integrated, the old and the new, the evolving technology and the traditional principles, how do we make choices to teach? You suggested we are the leaders of the souls of our students, and that attention ought to be...
That's not originally working.
No, I know. But, how do we get there in the current climate?
Well, it's by, as you know, what I think we should revitalize the rhetorical tradition. We should revitalize a rhetorical education. All those skills of self-control, restraint, discipline, memory, common sense, judgment. Of course, they're not dogmas, they're not doctrines, and they're not disciplines like that you can put people through and know how they're going to emerge and have outcomes and measurements for them. But they are things that to be aware of when we teach, when we design curricula, when we set expectations for students, when we take them through a curriculum, when we set goals for courses. We have them in mind. There's no direct way, there never has been a direct way to inculcate them in people, which is impossible anyway, because they're dependent on a model of something like growth. Growth or the Bildung of the person. It has to come from the person. But that's what rhetoric does. It builds a structure for that to happen in, where people don't just sit in chairs and face forward, where they stand in front of the class and speak, where they have to memorize their speeches, where they have to develop the capacity for attention and focus and purpose and not get lost while they're doing it, but to know what they're doing. And to have the capacity to do it themselves and not just have it done to them.
Lisa Ede said something yesterday that was interesting to me, because she said she was constructing her blog, the first message for her blog, and it was complicated for her because she didn't quite know who her audience would be. Mm-hmm. So how would you, as a rhetorician, help students to construct messages for audiences of blogs? I mean, the same principles that Aristotle set forth 2,000 years ago, would they help Lisa in constructing her initial blog message to an unknown audience?
So, like I have the answer to this, whether Aristotle work for Lisa's students. The answer is not going to come from somebody who knows Aristotle. It's going to come from people who know Aristotle, who know the rhetorical tradition, who have the vocabulary, who know the concepts, who know things that have been tried in the past, who are aware of different kinds of pedagogical choices that can have lots of them, who try things out, informed by all that, in the particular context they're in, who have good judgment and can read the real situation and remember what they're trying to do in it and adapt to the situation and carry out their work as teachers and go with what works, just the way we all do when we're not under too much stress. Kevin?
So I have a slightly more theoretical question, and I wonder if you could just say more about the distinction between rhetoric and attention. I'm interested in this idea. It sounds like you're kind of almost suggesting attention as a replacement term for rhetoric, but I'm not sure how the structures that Lanham's talking about and how your claim for attention as an intellectual virtue relates to the tradition of rhetoric as an intellectual virtue. Does that make sense?
Attentiveness, if that's like the virtue form of the word attention. Attentiveness, I'm trying to suggest that maybe it's an intellectual virtue, that maybe that's the way we should think of it. One of those capacities or powers of mind without which we can't do the intellectual work we need to do. And it's a virtue, it's a characteristic of us, it's a power we have. It's not just a technique. And it requires formation through lots of different kinds of educational processes. So I'm not suggesting it's a replacement for rhetoric. It's one part of those sorts of virtues that we're taking to be part of the formation of the student in a rhetorical curriculum, along with memory and common sense and judgment and other capacities and powers. But I want to add attentiveness to it because it seems to me that that's the crisis. The crisis is this scarcity of attention. And it's a scarcity of attention because there's lots of information and not enough attention for it. But it's a crisis in education because it's an individual crisis for us, as well as a crisis for people who run industries and businesses and everything else. You know, it's a crisis for me when I sit down at my laptop and I have a limited amount of time, I have some work I want to get done, and I start thinking of all the things I could be looking at, all the pleasures I could be getting in that little screen, all I could be listening to, all the things I haven't kept up with, all the things I want to know. Right? And they're actually, I can almost see them in my mind right now, flashing. I can see the icons for them. They're in my memory. So it's a personal crisis, too. But that's why I want to look back at rhetorical education, because it was a formation process in this larger sense. Of how do you form a person that has the power to deal with that kind of an environment, that kind of a situation, to make choices, to stay focused, to remember, to pay attention in the proper way. Proper things. Yeah, move across.
Well, I'm wondering if...
Allison, right?
Yes. I'm wondering if maybe it's attentiveness is also just this problem sort of socially, because I read this really interesting article about the kids that were coming into college now, and how, in general, they've had these wonderful parents. Well, not everyone, of course, we know that. But, there's kind of all these parenting trends about soccer and ballet and this and that, and that their social lives are so planned out, particularly the high-end students that are coming in, who had speech and debate and had football and had it all and did interact, and it was all on the form. And then they come to college and they go through this crisis of, not having this. And I actually read the article when I was working at student housing, and, we were talking about programs that we could develop that would make them feel more comfortable and sort of extend that highly structured time thing. And it makes them think that they're not really being attentive in their social interactions in a way, because it's always planned out. And MySpace has all of these nice boxes that you fill. There's this equality of access. All of your friends know exactly what's on your MySpace, so you don't really have to filter who you're telling what. And so maybe a way of building that attentiveness in would be to kind of handhold, or in the academic process, if we could come up with some sort of way to very structurally guide them towards attentiveness, because maybe that's what they want. So maybe if we, I don't know what it would look like, but maybe if we could sit down and come up with a way and being like, okay, you're going to spend 15 minutes thinking about what's really important, or I don't know if there would be a way of sort of structuralizing the teaching of attentiveness, but that might be some sort of a solution or an idea at any rate.
Last question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the film people in the room are probably thinking about trying to teach college students silent film, and how their immediate reaction is usually going to be something along the lines of, wow, people back in the 1900s used to have really long attention spans. So I'm thinking, like, the way you're describing the problem is that it's not a width problem, it's more like a depth problem. So how would you convince students to look at it as instead of looking at it as a problem with attention span, looking at it as a problem with attentiveness, and kind of taking it and moving deeper with it?
Yeah, they're related, but they're different.
Right.
Yeah. How would you do that with silent film? How do you do it?
I don't think the problem ever gets resolved until probably the second class in the series, when they start looking at more modern film and start thinking about some of the stuff that they saw in silent film and more modern film. That's my experience. But that's film. I'm not sure how that would work in rhetoric.
It's already an interesting juxtaposition of film concerns and rhetoric concerns. Thank you very much.